Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here on this anniversary. It actually brought back a memory for me, namely it was February 1990 when I had the privilege of going to Tokyo, Japan, to give a talk about East Europe, part of the world about which not much was then known or understood in Japan. And this was a business talk to a business community, people from the financial ministry and so on. And much to my amazement, when I showed up and there was this audience of about 400 people, everyone received in February 1990 an authentic cut from the Berlin Wall. It contains a soft pouch and a declaration of authenticity. So for those of you who would like to touch this after the talk, feel free to come up to the table. It says something about the power of commerce. Now, it is my pleasure today to welcome in our midst someone who is not part of the world of commerce, but rather who comes from the world of ideas, Jiri Pehe. It was my good fortune to have met Jiri, to have made his acquaintance back some 20 years ago when he was Director of East European Studies at Freedom House in New York. Jiri was born in Prague. He studied law and philosophy at Charles University. In Prague, he received a law degree. He fled Czechoslovakia in 1981, subsequently settled in the United States, and in 1985 he graduated from the School of International Affairs at Columbia University of New York. He then had a very interesting journey, of which I'll simply mention some chapters from 1988 to 1995, he worked as an analyst of Central European affairs and later as director of Central European Research at the Research Institute of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Munich, Germany. Starting in the early 1990s, he relocated to Prague, where from 1995 to 97 he was director of analysis and research department of the Open Media Research Institute, which was a successor to the research department of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And then from 1997 to 99, he was director of the political department of Czech President Václav Havel, and later served as President Havel's advisor. He is today a member of the program committee of the Forum 2000 Foundation, which organizes annual international conferences under Václav Havel's auspices. It was my privilege a year, maybe I guess it was about a year ago, to be in Prague, to be on hand when, on the occasion of the publication of a novel by Jiri, which hopefully will soon appear in English. He's at work on another novel, but in the meantime, he's authored hundreds of articles, several books that are focused on developments in Eastern Europe, and he regularly publishes in Czech, German, and the English-speaking world. Currently, he is the director of the New York University in Prague and the head of the New York University's Prague Institute for Democracy, Economy, and Culture. I'm delighted to welcome him here at Middlebury for the first time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for a very nice introduction. Today is another anniversary. Michael mentioned that I emigrated from Czechoslovakia in 1981, and actually on this day 26 years ago I arrived in the United States as an immigrant, so for me this day is memorable for other reasons as well. When Michael mentioned the Berlin Wall, I don't have any stone that I could show you, but I remember that on that day I spent the day with my German friends, and the pictures of Berlin Wall collapsing brought all of my friends to tears. So I was surrounded by about 10 Germans who were all crying like small children. So I remember this very vividly, because that happens to you not so often in your life. Anyway, I'm supposed to talk about what has happened since then, and for the sake of clarity, I would perhaps divide this into the reforms, changes that have occurred since 1990, 1989 into 4 areas. And so I will speak about political reforms, or reforms in the area of political democracy, economic reforms, the rule of law, and civil society. All of those 4 areas are extremely important for the functioning of any democracy, and all of them are, of course, tied together. You cannot really have, for example, a functioning market economy if you don't have a rule of law, and you cannot have really the rule of law unless you have a developed, vibrant civil society. And I mentioned those 4 areas in a particular order simply because I think that it is perhaps the easiest task of when you speak about those 4 areas, to establish or re-establish functioning political institutions or institutions of democracy. It is a bit more difficult to create a market economy from an economy that was fully controlled by the state. It is even more difficult to establish the rule of law, because you can certainly pass and adopt many good laws, but if you don't have citizens who actually respect the law, you don't have the rule of law. And finally, the 4th area, civil society, is the most difficult of all, because you cannot decree it. You cannot pass any law that actually creates a civil society. It is an organism that has to grow from below, and therefore this is why it's so difficult to establish it or re-establish it. If you look at East Central Europe, in light of these 4 areas, I would argue that re-establishing the system of political democracy, or establishing it, because some countries had not previously had political democracy, was as I said, the easiest of those tasks, simply because there were certain recipes, cookbooks, one may say, that we could follow. We could look at the constitutions, for example, of neighboring countries. We could get inspired by the American example. We could look into our own history, and in some cases there were democratic traditions. In Czechoslovakia, for example, there was a democratic system from 1918 to 1938. And therefore, it was not as difficult as reviving the other areas to reestablish political democracy. That was done fairly soon. All of the countries in the region called early in 1990, in most cases, in some cases in 1989, called free elections, in which democratic forces prevailed. And in this first round of political changes, also some constitutional changes were made to make it possible for the system of checks and balances to work. There were some reforms of political institutions, and at the same time, political parties began to emerge. I should mention that if you, in all of the post-communist countries at that time, in the first few months of their new free existence, we really didn't have political parties in the traditional sense of the word. We had political movements which spearheaded the changes, movements that served as umbrella movements for democratic forces, and eventually, in most cases, after the first free elections, those movements began to fall apart, and political parties began to emerge from those movements. In some countries, this process of political party creation is still going on. You can see that some countries, such as the Czech Republic, have a very stable political spectrum, pretty much along classical Western lines or West European lines. It means a conservative party, some centrist parties, a social democratic party, and so on. Some countries, such as Poland, still, I think, are not at the end of this process, and new parties keep emerging before each election. But that process goes on, and I would say that overall the process of reestablishing institutions of political democracy is well advanced. At the same time, of course, as you know, democracy is not just a system of political institutions or mechanisms, but also a culture. And that is a much more difficult task, and I think that if we evaluate what has happened in the last 18 years, we can say that, yes, we have been able to create institutionally democracies in Eastern Europe, but those democracies are democracies without democrats, as the first president of Czechoslovakia after 1918, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, liked to say about his own country when he was asked about Czechoslovakia. He said, well, we have democracy, but we don't have democrats. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but at the same time, of course, it is true to a large extent, because while putting in place institutional changes, reforms, and so on is something that can be done from above, by adopting appropriate laws and so on, changing people's minds, creating a certain kind of culture, democratic culture, in which you have values such as tolerance, culture of dialogue, and so on, respect for the opinions of others. That is not easy, and that is perhaps a generational change. And we see that most countries in the region are still struggling with this task. So, if we talk about political changes, that was, in my opinion, a great success. And today, even when you look at the countries of Eastern Europe, from the perspective of the European Union, for example, there are not many problems. Those countries are not criticized for the way in which their institutions, democratic institutions, work. The second area I mentioned was the area of market economy. And that was in many ways more difficult because, as I said before, in some cases almost 100% of the economy was controlled by the state. In some countries it was less, but still, how do you create a market economy from a system that is fully controlled by one entity, that is the state? There were different ideas as to how to achieve this in various countries. Hungary, for example, early on decided to sell as many state-held assets to foreign investors as possible. And they decided to do so simply because Hungary was the most indebted country, a country with a huge foreign debt, and they realized that they have to also raise money during this or in this process. In the Czech Republic or in Czechoslovakia, a degree of what could be called economic nationalism prevailed, and it was argued that we should not sell our national assets to foreigners. And therefore different schemes were invented. In Poland, there was initially not much movement towards privatization. It was of large state companies. It was decided that it would be better to create smaller new entities from below that could compete with state enterprises. So there were various approaches. If you look at these various approaches in a comparative way, I think that Czechoslovakia was perhaps the most interesting case because it came up with two ways of recreating market economy, which were quite novel. One of them was a large-scale restitution of assets that had been confiscated or nationalized by the communists in 1948. There were two waves of restitution, the so-called small wave and large. The first concerned small assets such as restaurants, hotels, apartment buildings, and the later wave concerned big factories, firms, and so on. So in all cases where original owners whose property was confiscated by the communists could be found, or in some cases their descendants, those assets were returned to the original owners. You can imagine it was a huge mess because it involved many claims which could not be in many cases substantiated. Courts got involved, and actually some of those battles, court battles, are still on today, 18 years later. But overall, this was a scheme that helped to that made it possible for the state, for the government, to return very quickly many assets to private owners and privatize a large chunk of the economy. Another Czechoslovak novelty was the so-called coupon or voucher privatization, which was a very hotly discussed and debated scheme, criticized by some or praised by some. The scheme consisted in a very or was based on a very simple idea. All companies that the state wanted to privatize with the help of this scheme would be turned into shareholding or joint stock companies in which the state owned 100% of all shares. And then citizens were offered the possibility to buy so-called vouchers, voucher books with vouchers which they could exchange for the shares in those companies. 6 million people in Czechoslovakia participated in this scheme. It was very popular. However, of course, it created many problems because it created a large class of people, all of whom held 1 or 2 or 3 shares. It didn't really create the kind of ownership you need for running companies. And moreover, this was done without first privatizing the banks and without creating a stock market. So a lot of economic fraud and problems followed. I think that this scheme really began to work for the country economically towards the end of the 90s, in the second half of the 90s, but initially it was more or less a mess. If you look at other countries, some of them tried to follow this. Romania, for example, also tried to have its own voucher scheme. Some countries followed the restitution method to some extent, but not to the extent that Czechoslovakia used, because they were already aware of all the legal problems it could create. Nevertheless, with the help of a variety of methods, the economy in most countries was eventually privatized. I would say that if you look across East Central Europe today, you would discover that 70 to 80% of the economies of those countries are privatized, and they are very well integrated into a broader network within the European Union. So this was something that worked in the end, despite the initial wave of economic fraud and all kinds of schemes. We are still dealing with some of the consequences. One of the biggest and best known cases of economic fraud involved a certain Viktor Kožený, a Czech entrepreneur who returned to Czechoslovakia from Harvard University with an undergraduate degree and established something that was called Harvard Funds, which offered their services to those 6 million Czechs who bought vouchers. Said, okay, we will manage your vouchers or your shares because you have no experience with capitalism. He managed to get up to 13 billion crowns out of the pockets of citizens. And after that, he fled to the Bahamas, where he still is enjoying the fruits of his work. And there are several court cases against him. He tried to do the same thing with some American entrepreneurs in Azerbaijan. So he's being sought by American authorities, but also, of course, by the Czech authorities. Nevertheless, it seems that he will spend the rest of his life in the Bahamas, enjoying the 13 billion crowns that he managed to accumulate. So, not everything was smooth, and there were these little quirks, let's say, in the process. But overall, it was a success. The third area I mentioned was the rule of law, and that is, of course, an area which, as I said before, is more difficult. You really, it's not enough to pass good laws and claim that you have established the rule of law. Under communism, we had wonderful constitutions, for example. We had some wonderful laws, but no one respected them, and the state actually violated its own laws on a regular basis. This is something that this is a legacy that is still with most of East Central Europe. People do still have problems with respecting the laws. For an average Czech or Pole, the first idea that comes across his or her mind when they see some law is how can I get around it, rather than how do I respect it. And that is, of course, a problem which has to do with the fourth area I mentioned, and that is civil society. You really need not only active, but you need an educated citizenry, people who are really invested in their system, democratic system, and who believe in certain values, to be able to have a functioning rule of law. And that is perhaps just like creating the civil society itself, a generational project. It's not really easy to change people's minds overnight. I think that a very important role in all of this was played by external forces, especially by the European Union. Especially this third area was really pushed by the European Union. It means adopting certain laws, making sure that they get implemented, and all of that. That was done to a large extent under the guidance of the European Union. This whole process started roughly around 1995, and most East European countries applied for membership in the European Union, and then they went for 10 years through a very structured and difficult process of coping with the requirements of the European Union and persuading Brussels that they actually can be members of the European Union. And I think it's really necessary to stress that the European Union played a key role in helping to reestablish democratic institutions and, above all, the rule of law in the region. There was a huge transfer of know-how from Brussels and from old members of the European Union to the region. Many reforms that took place were done under the guidance of the European Union, and the process, in fact, was highly structured into many different areas. In each area, each country that applied for membership had to persuade the European Union that it has reformed its law and policies in the particular area, or that it will within a certain period of time. I think that without the European Union, it would have taken much longer to modernize institutions in the region. In fact, I would argue that what happened in East Central Europe is a miracle of sorts, because the amount of work, reforms on modernizing institutions and creating functioning democracies and market economy that was done is really unparalleled if you think about the fact that this was all done within roughly 10 years. And that, of course, is also a problem, because many people could not really cope with the speed of this change. So we have a certain gap in the region now between what has been achieved institutionally and between what people have been able to absorb. And that is, of course, causing problems both politically and on the individual level. We have quite a few people in all countries in East Central Europe who really do not accept what has been done fully, have not embraced this change fully, because they paid a heavy price for those changes, and some of them were left behind. And then, of course, we have political parties which have exploited this this change, and basically are now arguing, look, we have had enough of the European Union's tutelage, of their efforts to tell us what to do, and we are now also, because we are members, we are now mature enough to do things our own way. So there is a certain rise of in a very strange kind of populism, which basically is very critical of the European Union and its efforts to help the region. Again, it depends to a large extent on which country we are talking about. Some countries, I think, are quite happy on average with their membership in the European Union, especially some of the small, very flexible countries such as Slovenia or Estonia. Then if you go to countries such as, larger countries such as Poland, you will find a lot of resistance and a lot of opposition to EU membership, a lot of criticism, and also a lot of efforts on the part of Polish leaders to gain as much for Poland as possible, very often to the detriment of other members. So that is what this very quick process of modernization, accession to the European Union has caused. And I mentioned before the civil society. I think that this is perhaps the most difficult task. Of course, all governments in the region have tried to help the growth of civil society to some extent. Some of them did it more promptly and faster than some other governments. In Czechoslovakia, for example, there was some resistance to this initially. We had a slightly schizophrenic situation in which we had a president, Václav Havel, who really advocated the creation of or recreation of civil society, and we had Prime Minister Václav Klaus, who still to this day claims that there is no such thing as civil society, that this is an invention of communitarian thinkers. So we have this very interesting discussion going on about this issue of civil society. Nevertheless, if you look at the real state of affairs, you will discover that in most countries, the foundations of a civil society have been created. If I mention some data from the Czech Republic, the country of 10 million people has roughly 90,000 associations and groups, initiatives, which form the backbone of the civil society in the Czech Republic. I think that given the time frame, 18 years, it is a success. But of course, much more needs to be done. If you look at the structure of the civil society in most post-communist countries, you will discover that there are a lot of groups that are involved with, let's say, charity or ecological activism and so on. But there are very few groups which we can call public policy groups, groups that express their views on various policies and serve as resources for political parties, sources of expertise for political parties. That probably will take a long time to create. I should mention that American foundations in particular played a very important role in this area. Early on, many large American foundations were present in East Central Europe, promoting the growth of civil society, investing a lot of money in all kinds of affairs, ranging from training journalists to creating know-how for local citizens, for example, in forming civic groups and so on. So this was something that was really a great contribution of the United States and its culture, which is heavily based on civil society. But of course, as I mentioned before, it is really also the question of changing people's minds, and that is indeed very difficult. We are talking about people who spent, in some cases, 40 years of their lives under a totalitarian system. They were used to the division, total division between private and public life. In Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Poland, you would see each Friday you would see a strange phenomenon: millions of people leaving cities and heading for their cottages, where they could really be free from the system. And this total division of public and private was really is still present in the region. I mentioned that this is to some extent a generational change. I have a lot of hope for the young generation. If you look at young Czechs, for example, you see that they are more active, much more active than the older generation. They are much more aware of, for example, the advantages that the European Union, being a European, offers to them, and that is an encouraging sign. From my own experience, I can see the change in transformation in the attitudes of students that I teach at Charles University. When I started teaching in 1994, students were very passive. They were really, to a large extent, products of the previous system, and they wouldn't get engaged in any dialogue. They were afraid of speaking, and they didn't have any languages they could really use outside Czech. Today, when I come to a class, I see a totally different generation. Young people who have traveled, spent time abroad, very often a semester or two at foreign universities. If you ask them what they did the previous weekend, they tell you, I visited my friends in Madrid or Rome, or I had friends from Finland. They are Europeans. They have a different outlook, and I think this is perhaps the most encouraging development I can report. And this is true about the whole region. This is not just the Czech Republic. The final remark I would like to make is about the role of the external factors. I mentioned the European Union, and I really think that this was a very, very important side of changes that took place in East Central Europe after 1989. We have to realize that what we see is a completely new situation from what existed in Europe, for example, before World War II. Czechoslovakia before World War II was a democratic country, but basically with no chances of surviving because it was surrounded by totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. There was no help from the outside, no effort by other democracies to really help each other to the extent that was necessary. If you look at the environment today, you can see that there is really an environment, a club of democracies, which are really offering help. They are very, very active in transferring know-how, in working on the stabilization of democratic institutions and market institutions in the new democracies, and that is a huge change in comparison with what we had only 50, 60 years ago. And that's why I'm also hopeful, because I think that without this external framework, the region, given its lack of tradition, democratic traditions, given some of the patterns of political culture, could slide in some cases back to authoritarian regimes. But there is this net that is in place, framework, which really helps to keep democratic systems in place. And I think that if those institutions, as they have been created, stay in place for a generation or two, democracy in the region will be very firmly entrenched. If you look at the European Union, now we are part of, all of the countries are now in the region are now part of this organization, which means they are part of an open space, where you have free movement of people, goods, capital, and so on. On the 21st of December this year, all new countries, member countries, will become members of the Schengen space, which means that borders will be abolished, internal borders, and that I think is also a very significant achievement for a variety of reasons, but of course for the symbolic reasons as well. If you look at the Czech Republic, it is a country that 18 years ago was really looking like a concentration camp of sorts. It was a country surrounded by guard towers, border guards with dogs and machine guns and barbed wire, and if you try to cross the border, you would be shot. Today, this country, well, actually in a few weeks, will have no borders at all, which I think is very significant and highly symbolic. So I think that a huge progress has been made, and I'm glad that I can report to you on this progress. Thank you.
Jiri will now take questions, and I believe we have a microphone which we're going to pass around. So please.
Hello, my name is Asia Bujowska, and I come from Poland. And I've been observing massive migration to British Islands. I myself lived in England, in London, and I had an inside experience of a Polish community within London and really large dissatisfaction with what's happening in Poland nowadays and with misrepresentation of young people's views by their government representatives. And I'm wondering, how do you relate these migrations to the changes that have been occurring since the breakdown of the Berlin Wall? And with what possible impact on, progress in Poland, or with more stability in terms of, as you mentioned, very quickly emerging novel parties and.
Well, this large-scale immigration from Poland and also from Lithuania, which is another case where large numbers of young people left, in particular for Great Britain. Now we see an exodus of Romanians to Italy, which has caused some problems in Italy, which have been reported in the world media. I think that it is to some extent an economic issue. It is not a coincidence that the largest flood of people leaving the region is in Poland and in Lithuania and in Romania. And the question is, and I think that is relevant to what you were asking about, how many of those people will come back, whether this is a permanent situation, brain drain, and so on, and whether those young people will return? That is of course a good question. It has had some impact on political developments in Poland. You know that because of this exodus, at least partly because of that, the Kaczynski brothers were able to do so well, because a large segment of the young generation would never vote for the Law and Justice Party, were gone, and they really didn't, although they could, they didn't bother to vote in large numbers in Great Britain, and that is that has certainly had some impact on the situation in Poland. I think that in the last election that took place a few weeks ago, in which the Kaczynskis were defeated, part of the success was that that a lot of young people were able to mobilize, both in Poland and abroad. I looked at the data, and it seems that many more young people living in Great Britain, elsewhere in Europe, actually voted abroad, and above all, many young people in Poland voted, and that, I think, is part of the result, or is the cause of the result and the defeat of the Kaczynskis. But I think that overall it's inevitable that once you create this common space and you have countries with very uneven levels of economic development, that you will have, in some cases, large movements of people trying to find a better living somewhere else. And hopefully when the economic situation in Poland and some other East European countries improves, people will come back. We can see that there is very little of this in some better economically better doing or performing countries. The Czech Republic has, for example, almost no such problem with large numbers of young people leaving for the West. So I believe it's tied to an economic development.
You stated your belief in the connection of market economies with democratic qualities and civil societies and rule of law. But don't the examples of China and unfortunately even Russia today so suggest we might want to re-examine that market economies can in fact function within more authoritarian regimes, and that the connection that we would want to make between free markets and democracy may be a fading phenomenon?
I don't know. I would wait with this. My feeling is that with China, we may still be surprised. I think that what is being created in China is a real market economy, which is not yet functioning fully in a proper, let's say, legal framework that we know from the West. But many centers of independence, which entrepreneurs represent and businesses represent, have been created, and that may be eventually a real challenge for the Chinese regime. I don't want to predict anything. I recently, just in joke, said to someone that the Nazi regime in Germany and the communist regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed exactly 9 years after that they organized the Olympic Games. So maybe 2017 is the year. But seriously, I think that in my opinion, there's a problem with comparing China and Russia, because Russia is really becoming increasingly what Fareed Zakaria describes as energy-dependent countries, or countries exporting energy, and the market economy in Russia is not really developing across the board. It is the state and the oligarchs who have all the power because they control energy sources, and that is usually very detrimental to any democratic development, because the central structures get a lot of power that they would not have otherwise. So if Russia manages to use its newly acquired wealth to build a market economy, perhaps that may have some effect on the democratic system as well. If it, however, becomes just another typical oil exporting country. We'll probably see a political model more resembling some Middle East regimes or Venezuela.
I'm interested in the attempt by the United States to station missiles in the Czech Republic and in Poland. And I'm wondering what your take on that is and what you think the Czechs and Poles make of that. Does anybody really think that has anything to do with Iran? Is it old Cold War leftovers? And if so, are we securing the population of Poland and the Czech Republic against Russia as a non-existent or former enemy? What do people really think about this?
Well, if you look at various surveys, public opinion surveys, then majorities of people don't like it. Although there is one survey about 2 days old which indicates that if this and this and this condition was met and some other conditions were met, then 55% of Czechs would agree with the radar, but it reminds me, or I think it sort of is the same thing as if someone did a survey on the chances of Hillary Clinton and said it would be someone else actually than Hillary Clinton who would run. So then, you know, she would. So they are basically substituting. They are substituting in asking those questions. If these and these conditions are met, and this is actually this way and that way, they are sort of substituting various additional conditions for a straightforward answer. And so if you look at those surveys which ask a simple question, do you want this base in the Czech Republic? You get 70 to 80% people are against it. There are different reasons for it. One of them is what you mentioned. Many people do not believe that this is really built against a threat from Iran or North Korea, that it has some other purpose. There is, of course, historical experience. Many Czechs have very traumatic experience with the presence of foreign troops on the territory of the Czech Republic. This is a country that's been occupied many times in its history. And then, of course, one has to take into account the fact that this is not really resolutely supported even in the United States. I think that Czech politicians, the government that pushes this very strongly, probably fails to see that that people are not entirely stupid, and they are able to see through from various information sources how this is viewed in the United States, and very simply, it is not on the agenda of a single presidential candidate in this country. No one speaks about it, and it can be easily overturned, changed after the presidential election. So it's a very controversial project. I think that the discussion will continue, although the Czech Parliament should vote on this in January. I would recommend them not to, because I think it could bring down the government, simply because one of the three coalition parties, the Greens, are not entirely in favor of this project, and if they vote against it, it could easily lead to the collapse of the government. In Poland, the situation is similar. The new government wants to have more dialogue with the Americans about this, so we'll see. But it's a lot of skepticism about this project, and one has to understand the reasons are different in Poland and in the Czech Republic, but overall, most people are against it.
I have a question about the cultural impact. I have a question about the cultural impact of the Berlin Wall, and it sort of parallels studies in biological ecology. When you create islands, they have a different evolutionary trajectory than the rest of the world that's more in the mainstream. And I'm wondering if you could sort of depart from the spirit of what you've already said, which I thought was really excellent, about how the West and the accession of Eastern Europe has brought new and fresh ideas and institutions to the East. Could you reflect a little bit, maybe from the point of view of your students that you're now teaching, about the resurgence of deeply rooted Eastern European values and how they may in time resurface and play a role in revitalizing the region or impact the European Union?
I'm not entirely sure what East European values are. That would be my answer. And that it's we often hear our politicians say that perhaps our biggest contribution to the European Union is our experience, that we lived for such a long time under totalitarian regimes, and many people, at least in some countries, fought against those regimes. On the other hand, it could be also a negative experience that and I mentioned some of that people are really not very active, and they don't understand the values of active citizenship and all of those things. So I'm not sure what the values that Eastern Europe can offer exactly are in all of this. At this point, what I see in my students, for example, is that they are trying to become as much as possible Western Europeans. They are trying to be like the rest of Europe, and there is a significant shift in this sense. For example, if you look at the ideas that these young people have, the generation of today's teenagers, for example, in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia, in Poland, they are much more. They do not deal anymore with the communist legacy. It's not so important to them. They are much more sensitive to questions that their counterparts in the West are sensitive to. That is the issues of globalization, climate change, big supranational corporations, divisions or differences in wealth between the North and South and all of those things, and they speak in those terms. So if you want to have a conversation with them that we had with our counterparts, or I had with my students 10 years ago, which were still pretty much framed in the Cold War terminology, you won't get it. This is a different generation. And they are, by the way, they are also showing certain resistance to consumerism. They are not at all impressed. The first generation, post-communist generation, was very impressed with material values. With shopping mall became a new kind of church, at least in some countries in Central Europe. And this generation is not impressed with it anymore. They want something else. They are looking for alternatives. So that's an interesting change. It's very difficult to say where it will lead. But I would say certainly that this youngest generation looks much more like their Western counterparts, which maybe, unfortunately, in my view, also involves growing anti-Americanism in Eastern Europe.
I was wondering about, you were talking about the Czech Republic specifically having a kind of a successful recovery after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was wondering how maybe a stronger sense of nationalism and also the past history of such a strong democracy, that when the communist occupation began, many Czechs thought that they would actually be part of the Western side, and they were extremely disappointed. Just completely hopeless feeling after the communists actually ended up occupying their country. And I was wondering kind of how that played into the recovery and this very strong national pride. I don't know.
Nationalism, of course, is a very, very potent tool, certainly in political struggle. I would say, though, that it is to some extent artificial. There's of course sort of natural let's say, patriotism in all of those countries. But nationalism is a different kind of thing, and to some extent, certainly if you look at Western Europe, it's a phenomenon that is tied to the first half of the 20th century and 19th century. And of course, in the former communist countries, it was sort of suppressed or frozen because the communists would not allow any natural development in this sense. But what I see in the region is that perhaps with the exception of Poland, where it really plays a role at this point, and it was quite skillfully used by, let's say, by the Kaczynski's brothers and so on, and some other parties. It is not really a very strong phenomenon, nationalism. I think that again, there's a generational divide. Older people are probably more prone to have certain nationalist feelings. Young people, they show what you could describe as nationalism in some cases, and of course you have extreme parties, and you know, but on the mainstream is really basically European, and they don't put that much emphasis on nationalism. At the same time, there's a very interesting development, because if you were Czech and you would go abroad 15 years ago, you would be sort of ashamed. You would not want to reveal that you are from Czechoslovakia, from the Czech Republic. You would think there are certain connotations there, and I'm coming from a country which lived for 40 years under communism, and a country that is now relatively poor in comparison with the West, and there's nothing to be proud of. And today, I think especially young people, again, they are very proud to be Czechs, but not in the nationalist sense of the word. They are proud of the fact that their country has made such a huge progress, and they can really compete with other countries in Europe.
One more question, excuse me. Also in regards to what you said about young people, that they have as a new mindset, a different mindset than their parents' generation. How do you, in what form does the dialogue between the generation of my parents and older people and my generation take place? How does this dialogue look like, and what part in it plays curiosity of my generation about my parents' mind frame, about what were the values of my parents, and what role plays the nostalgia after communism?
Well, you know, this is a very interesting question. Of course, there is some disconnect between the young and older generations in all countries in Western civilization, but it is even more pronounced in Eastern Europe, where you have really a generation of people who have embraced their new situation. Europe, these are also people who are very skilled with new technologies, whereas the older generation is totally lost in this respect in Eastern Europe, because they didn't have a chance to sort of learn this during the late stages of communism, when some people who are older today in the West really started working with those technologies. So there is a huge gap, I don't know what is a good answer to your question, because quite frankly, I don't think that young people are very interested in their parents' experience. And partly because, and I think that the older generation is partly guilty of that, because no one really bothered to create a good system of education or educating young people about what it was to live under communism. And partly because many people who are now part of the older generations were practitioners, so that they lived in that system. It's very difficult for them psychologically to talk about it, because inevitably a question from a teenage daughter or son will be, and what did you do? And then you have to do some explaining. And if you don't want to lie, you will have to tell your son or daughter, well, you know, I did this and this and this. And I think that most people prefer to keep silent about it. That's why there is, and in schools, there's really no good curriculum to teach the communist regime's history. So perhaps it will be the next generation. You know, we know that in Germany, it was the generation that came in the 60s that really started dealing with the history of Germany and the crimes of parents and grandparents quite openly. So it may take a few more years.
We are unfortunately out of time. I know there are still questions out there, so please come up and continue the conversation informally. And thank you all for coming and for a wonderful